For Lieutenant Klaus Richter of the 352nd Artillery Regiment, the day opened as routinely as every other dawn along the Normandy shoreline. A thin veil of cold moisture drifted above the English Channel, muting sound and wrapping the coastline in a pale grey hush. The air bit at his lungs, heavy with the familiar smell of seawater and rain-soaked soil. It was just past 5 in the morning, another shift, another stretch of tense observation. But when he raised his binoculars and peered through the fading darkness as the first weak glow of sunrise touched the horizon, the ocean began to transform. This was not a shifting tide. It was not a brewing storm system. What he saw defied logic. A massive shadow had formed where sky and sea merged, an expanding stain that continued to widen, sharpen, and multiply. This was no ordinary naval force. It was a moving city built of steel, an enormous floating civilization advancing out of the fog and directly into history. In that instant, before any Allied boots touched the sands below, before the world would even learn the names Omaha or Utah, Richter understood something chilling. The Third Reich was about to be swallowed by the sea. And to grasp the magnitude of what he was witnessing.
To truly understand the shock of that dawn, you must step into the mindset that ruled Fortress Europe in the spring of 1944. From the frozen shores of Norway down to the edge of Spain, German engineers had constructed what they believed was an unbreakable shield, the Atlantic Wall. It was envisioned as a continuous spine of reinforced concrete and steel, packed with artillery and machine guns, designed to be an absolute barrier against any Allied landing. In the thinking of Germany's high command and in the propaganda delivered daily to the troops, this wall was presented as proof of the Reich's invincibility. But Lieutenant Klaus Richter, a hardened professional soldier and survivor of the Eastern Front, understood how wide the gap was between speeches and truth. At 32 years old, he was old enough to remember the Germany that existed before the war, yet young enough to have been forged by its brutality. He had become cautious, analytical, and thoroughly exhausted by years of combat. He commanded an artillery battery of heavy, steel-barreled cannons mounted inside reinforced concrete bunkers several miles inland from the beaches the Allies would soon designate as Omaha. From his observation position, an embedded bunker carved into a high coastal bluff, he held a sweeping view of the channel. Day after day, he drilled his crews relentlessly. They ran firing calculations, serviced their weapons, and scanned the silent gray water stretching endlessly to the horizon. Every conversation eventually circled back to the same subject, the coming invasion. D-Day. The day that would decide everything. But the question that haunted every officer was when would it happen, and far more critically, where would it strike? German intelligence was firmly convinced that the main blow would fall at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest crossing of the English Channel. Strategically, it made perfect sense. That was where the 15th Army, the largest concentration of German forces in Western Europe, had been positioned in anticipation of the invasion. Normandy, by contrast, was viewed as a secondary theater, possibly a feint, a distraction designed to pull attention away from the real battlefield. It was never expected to be the primary landing zone. This assumption would prove to be one of the most catastrophic strategic errors of the war, and it was no coincidence. It was the direct result of a masterfully executed Allied deception effort known as Operation Fortitude, which left the German defenses in Normandy dangerously under-reinforced. Richter's own formation, the 352nd Infantry Division, was stronger than many other units in the region, but even it was only a pale echo of the elite formations that had swept across France 4 years earlier. Its ranks were a blend of hardened Eastern Front veterans like Richter himself, mixed with large numbers of teenage recruits and aging reservists. They were loyal and courageous, but they were no longer the lightning-fast assault troops of 1940. They were defensive soldiers, assigned to hold a front line that was stretched dangerously thin. The Atlantic Wall itself was less a continuous barrier and more a rough mosaic of defenses. Many fortifications were unfinished. Minefields were incomplete. And the vast spacing between positions meant that even heavily armed strongpoints could be surrounded and bypassed. Richter was painfully aware of these weaknesses. He had seen the farm paths local civilians still used, the dead zones in the overlapping firing arcs. Professionally, he remained deeply skeptical of their ability to withstand a truly determined amphibious assault. In the weeks leading up to, as June approached, the strain along the coast became almost tangible. Anxiety hung in the air like a presence you could feel. Field Marshal Owen Rommel, who had been assigned the responsibility of strengthening the coastal defenses, moved with relentless urgency. He ordered the placement of millions of land mines and thousands of sharpened steel barriers across the beaches. The soldiers gave these obstacles a grim nickname: Rommel's asparagus. Rommel grasped a reality that the leadership in Berlin appeared unwilling to accept. If the Allied landings were not crushed directly on the shoreline within the first 24 hours, the campaign in Western Europe would be effectively lost. Once the beachheads were established, Allied air superiority would tear apart any German units attempting to reinforce the coastline. After that moment, counterattacks would become nearly impossible. The opening day was not just important, it was decisive. But on June 5, then the weather shifted. A powerful storm rolled in, bringing violent winds and turbulent seas. Germany's meteorological office issued a confident forecast claiming that any major landing would be impossible for several days. That prediction caused many high-ranking commanders to let their guard down. It was the very reason Rommel himself was not even in France. He had returned to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday. The storm, they believed, would shield the coast from danger. So when Richter stood on watch in the freezing darkness before dawn on June 6, everything felt routine. The storm clouds had moved on, but the water was still rough. No one expected anything unusual. He was gazing toward the eastern horizon when he noticed a faint shimmer. He lifted his Zeiss field glasses and focused. His heart, which had been beating slowly in the quiet rhythm of night duty, suddenly began slamming violently against his chest. It was not a shimmer. It was ships. Not a scouting patrol. Not a small raiding group. Hundreds of vessels. And behind them even more. He swung his binoculars left. Then right. Everywhere he looked, the same sight filled the sea. The channel was no longer open water. It had become a solid expanse of dark, threatening silhouettes. A chilling fear crawled up his spine, the dread of a man staring at a mathematical equation that could never be solved. For several long seconds, Richter simply could not comprehend what he was seeing. The sheer scale defied logic itself. German intelligence had estimated that the Allies might be able to assemble 3,000 ships for an invasion, and even that figure had seemed unimaginably vast. What stood before him was far beyond that. What he saw was something entirely beyond comprehension. He attempted to count the vessels, but it was an exercise in futility. His mind, reacting instinctively, began to sort the shapes. He could discern the massive, imposing silhouettes of battleships and cruisers. Smaller, faster destroyers swarmed around them, moving like hunting wolves. And then there were the others, countless, unending others. Landing craft of every shape and size packed together so densely that they resembled iron filings clinging to a magnet. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and focused again. The sight remained unchanged. As the sun began its slow ascent, the image sharpened. Later, the official tally would record nearly 7,000 vessels, an armada contributed by 8 separate nations, the largest amphibious invasion force in history. But to Richter, it was never just a number. It was a tangible, overwhelming presence that seemed to curve the horizon itself. It was an industrial declaration so immense that everything he had known about warfare suddenly felt irrelevant. Germany had constructed walls of concrete. The Allies had countered with a bridge of steel. His hand, slick with sweat, gripped the field telephone. "This is Richter at Observation Post 4. I have a visual on the channel. There are ships." The voice on the other end sounded weary, dismissive. "We have reports of a few ships offshore, Lieutenant. Possibly a raid. Stand by." No, Richter's voice was tense, urgent. "You don't understand. It's not a few ships. It's thousands. The entire sea is covered, horizon to horizon. This is it. This is the invasion." A pause. Disbelief. RTOR could almost hear the man picturing him as a hysterical junior officer spooked by shadows. "The sea conditions are not suitable. Our reports indicate your observations are mistaken," the voice of the Oberleutnant said. Richter shouted, his voice cracking with frustration. I am looking at it with my own eyes. For God's sake, look at the sea. He slammed the phone down. The scale was too immense to be believed. Desperate, he tried another line to regimental headquarters and reached his commanding officer. RTOR here, sir. The invasion fleet is here. 10,000 ships. He knew he was understating the scene, but at that moment, even exaggeration felt inadequate. The major's voice was skeptical. Are you certain? The weather, RTOR began. The weather is clear enough to see the end of the world, Major, and it is sitting in the English Channel, requesting permission to open fire. This time, urgency pierced the chain of command. Imagination had failed them. Their plans, maps, intelligence reports, all of it was being erased by the reality floating just a few miles offshore. While Reuter's eyes tracked the vast armada, the high command remained fixated on reports of parachutists inland, assuming those were the main attack. No one was looking at the sea. RTOR alone saw the truth. He didn't wait for confirmation. He shouted orders to his men. Stirred by the sudden commotion, they leaned from their positions, faces etched with a mixture of awe and fear. They saw what he saw. The drills were finished. This was reality. Heavy shells were brought up from the magazines. Rangefinders called out figures that seemed impossibly large. The massive barrels of the cannons, silent for so long, slowly elevated, aiming their muzzles toward the unimaginable fleet. RTOR stood at his observation post, binoculars pressed tightly to his eyes. He could see the landing craft forming ranks. He felt the air vibrate, a low, constant hum of thousands of engines. It was the sound of a superpower breathing, and he was about to cast the first stone. The order came just before 6 a.m., engage at will. For RTOR, it was a release. The paralysis of disbelief shattered, replaced by the familiar precision of action. Fire, he bellowed into the telephone. Moments later, the ground trembled as the first gun discharged. Then a second, and a third. The shells screamed across the water. RTOR tracked them through his binoculars, a surge of professional pride blending with dread. Plumes of water erupted across the midst of the fleet. A miss, then another. His men were skilled. They corrected their aim, firing in precise, disciplined rhythm. For a fleeting moment, they made an impact. RTOR witnessed a direct hit on an American destroyer, the USS Corey. There was a sudden flash of orange, followed by a puff of black smoke. While some reports later suggested the ship may have also struck a mine, from Reuter's vantage point, his guns had drawn first blood. The destroyer listed, crippled, and eventually sank. A cheer erupted from his men. For a few minutes, it felt like a genuine battle. It felt as though their training truly mattered. But the sense of victory was fleeting. After the initial target was struck, the fleet did not falter. It did not slow. Any gap in formation was immediately filled. The endless lines of ships pressed forward, an unstoppable iron tide. Reuter's cannons fired repeatedly, yet for every single ship they might harass, hundreds sailed past unscathed. A profound sense of futility washed over him. He was a man armed with a bucket attempting to drain the ocean. His eyes swept beyond the immediate impacts of his shells to grasp the broader reality. Allied battleships, vessels like the USS Texas, were now pivoting their enormous 14-inch guns toward the shore. Then came the reply came in slowly at first, a low rumble traveling across the water. Flashes of light leapt from the massive ships on the horizon, like a silent lightning storm breaking across the gray sky. Moments later, the air around him seemed to tear itself apart. The ground heaved violently. Geysers of earth erupted from the fields. The methodical, industrial machinery of dismantling the Atlantic Wall had begun. Where was the German response? Where were the panzers? Where was the Luftwaffe? Reuter's eyes swept the skies, finding nothing but Allied aircraft, fighters, bombers, and transports. They dominated the air utterly, leaving no space for counteraction. German doctrine demanded armored counterattacks, but the nearest armored formation, the 21st Panzer Division, was frozen in place, paralyzed by confusion and the necessity of receiving a direct order from Hitler's headquarters. When it eventually moved, it advanced without air support into skies swarming with Allied fighter bombers, and it was cut down before even reaching the front lines. It was in that moment, with his own guns firing and the sky raining steel, that RTOR realized with a cold, horrifying clarity that this was no longer a battle. It wasn't a fight. It was an extermination. The Allies weren't attempting to outflank or outmaneuver him, they were attempting to erase him entirely. This single, personal understanding of overwhelming power defined the entirety of the Normandy campaign. The story of how industrial might eclipsed battlefield tactics is intricate and mesmerizing. If you find these detailed explorations of lesser-known historical perspectives compelling, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the like button. Doing so allows us to continue uncovering and sharing these vital human stories. As the naval bombardment intensified, RTOR felt something shift in his mind. The tactical part of his thinking shut down, replaced by a cold, terrifying lucidity. He no longer saw individual ships or soldiers, he saw the system behind them. He saw the factories. Through his shaking binoculars, he looked past the warships and envisioned, in his mind's eye, the assembly lines of Detroit. He imagined factories producing trucks, engines, and supplies on a scale Germany could only imagine. The logistics powering this invasion, the ability to supply hundreds of thousands of men on a hostile shore, wasn't some miracle. It was the inevitable product of industrial output. His gaze lifted to the sky, now filled with an endless stream of C-47 transport planes and fighter bombers. On D-Day, the Luftwaffe might have flown 300 sorties across all of France. The Allies flew over 14,000. For every single German aircraft in the sky, there were more than 40 Allied planes. This wasn't due to a lack of German bravery, it was the factories. And then there were the tanks. He was well aware of the reputation of the German panzers. The Tiger and Panther tanks were technological marvels, feared by Allied crews for their power and armor. Yet that superiority was ultimately a strategic dead end. They were intricate, costly, and slow to produce. For every intimidating Tiger that rolled off the assembly line, the Allies were cranking out dozens of simpler yet ruthlessly effective Sherman tanks. In the course of 1944 alone, the United States would produce over 29,000 tanks, while Germany's peak monthly output never exceeded 2,000. The Allied strategy wasn't to win tank battles through sheer technological superiority. Their plan was to overwhelm the panzers under a literal mountain of steel. This was the new reality, a brutal industrial equation of defeat. All the rhetoric about willpower, heroism, and ideological conviction dissolved in the face of these numbers. Nazi ideology had promised that a unified, determined populace could overcome decadent democracies. Yet here was undeniable proof: ideology could not stop a bomber. Willpower could not sink a battleship. RTOR felt a profound sense of inevitability. RTOR felt a profound, almost spiritual despair. He and his men were competent, disciplined soldiers. Yet they were about to die, not because they had been outmaneuvered or outfought, but because they were outnumbered on a scale that defied all comprehension. They were participants in a contest that had already been decided. He and his men, the entirety of the German army in the West, were like a meticulously forged sword confronting a steam-powered drop hammer. The outcome of this clash was never in doubt. He thought of the propaganda posters, of the unwavering belief back home in ultimate victory. It was all a lie, not just a political lie, but a mathematical one. The German high command must have been aware, they must have studied the production charts. Yet they had sent him and millions of others to fight a war they could never possibly win. It is no surprise that in the war's final year, the immense psychological strain and the confrontation with this impossible truth caused a rise in suicides among frontline officers. They were not only fighting soldiers from America, Britain, and Canada, they were battling the full, unrestrained power of the global industrial complex. As the sun rose higher, the abstract theory of their predicament transformed into a brutal, tangible reality. The naval bombardment swelled to a deafening crescendo, a relentless, rolling thunder that never ceased. The concrete of the bunker trembled with each impact, dust cascading from the ceiling. Through the narrow observation slit, RTOR could see the first waves of landing craft striking the shore. Higgins' boats dropped their ramps, disgorging American soldiers into the surf. The machine guns of the German pillboxes along Omaha Beach opened fire, tearing into the ranks of the first men ashore. From his elevated vantage point, RTOR watched the terrible drama unfold, the water turning red, the bodies piling up. For a fleeting moment, it appeared the defense might hold. The Americans were pinned down. But then, the industrial equation reasserted itself once more. Allied destroyers, witnessing the carnage, performed acts that were both suicidal and heroic. They steamed straight toward the shore, some closing to within 1,000 yards, scraping their hulls on sandbars. They trained their guns on the German bunkers, delivering direct fire support in a maneuver that decisively shifted the battle on Omaha. At the same time, strange new machines emerged. RTOR observed amphibious trucks, the Dukus, seemingly driving straight out of the ocean onto the beach. Tanks followed, crawling ashore, some fitted with massive flails designed to detonate mines. These were Hobart's Funnies, specialized armored vehicles the British had engineered specifically to overcome exactly these types of defenses. The Germans had nothing comparable. The scene below transformed from a desperate struggle into a methodical process of annihilation. German strongpoints were systematically blinded and destroyed by naval artillery, tank fire, and aerial bombs. On Omaha Beach alone, estimates indicate that the 352nd Division suffered roughly 1,200 casualties that day, a staggering proportion of its fighting force wiped out in just a few hours. Reuter's own battery had become a prime target. Shells struck closer and closer. A direct hit on one gun pit erupted in a fireball. Another gun was disabled. Telephone lines went dead. He was isolated. His command was shattered. He lifted his eyes to the sky one final time. It was a moving ceiling of Allied aircraft. On the water, the first wave of landing craft was already being replaced by a second, then a third. Beyond them, the vast armada waited, patient and unending, a conveyor belt of men and material that seemed as if it could flow forever. The Allies would land approximately 1,500 tanks on D-Day alone. The battle for the beach continued to rage, but the outcome had already been determined. It was merely a matter of time and tonnage. The war in Normandy would continue for another 2 months. The fighting in the hedgerows would be brutal and costly, yet it would change nothing. Every German tank destroyed was a loss that could never be replaced. Every Allied tank lost was replaced threefold. Every German soldier who fell left an unfillable gap in the line. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, and for the thousands of German soldiers who survived that first day, the remainder of the war was merely an epilogue. They fought on, driven by duty, by fear, or by a patriotism divorced from reality. But any hope of victory was gone. It had vanished in the first light of June 6. We often imagine the fall of the Third Reich as a slow, agonizing collapse, culminating in the battle for Berlin. Yet, for the men stationed along the Atlantic Wall, the end arrived in a single, horrifying instant of revelation. It was the moment they witnessed a fleet that filled the horizon, a sky blackened with enemy aircraft, and a force that was not merely an army, but the full, crushing weight of the modern industrial world. This was a new form of warfare, one waged not in the hearts of soldiers, but on the assembly lines of factories thousands of miles away. And for one German officer, peering through his binoculars at a sea that had been transformed into steel, it was the morning he knew the war was over.